Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 9th annual meeting of the Global Business School Network for Human Rights. I love seeing this group. We have a strong core group, but I'm equally delighted to see some new faces joining our work. Before we begin, I have to start with thanks. First to my team, heartfelt thanks to Sarah and Berit, who really helped to bring us all together here. The University of Geneva has been generally providing this room to us, and I'm most grateful that we can meet here every year. It's become such a treasured tradition for me to start off this very busy Human Rights Week at the Forum with all of you. Of course, I'm also really grateful to continue doing this work with Professor Michael Posner. He created the idea of bringing human rights to business school education with the NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights. And of course, I'm also very happy that we have the continuous support of Dan Leclerc, who heads the Global Business School Network and who has been helping to grow and sustain our community. So this year, I feel especially strong about how meaningful this get-together is, not despite the times, but because of the times we're living in. I think providing a moral compass for the next generation is more important than ever, and I'm very happy to see you as my allies. As every year, we have a really packed agenda. Maybe we can pull up the agenda, Sarah. We have 3 clusters. First, we start off with a panel. Really excited to have fantastic speakers that could offer their brief reflections on what's going on in the world. We live in tumultuous times. We have speakers from different regions, from India remotely, from South Africa remotely, from different disciplines, ethics and entrepreneurship, but also from practice. Kirsten is here. Mike is here, of course, commenting on what's going on in the US. It will be moderated by Dan, so this will be the first 45 minutes. We really hope to carve out time for your reactions and questions. And then in a second cluster, we'll hear from the research clusters that are part of our network. In total, we have 7 today. 3 will provide updates. And then in the end, we want to look forward and see how can we advance the agenda for integrating human rights in business school education. We have someone joining us from the Case Center, and we'll talk briefly about Prime and our idea of creating regional clusters. So that's today. We have until 10:45 with the online community. If you're joining remotely, warm welcome as well. People here in the room, if you're remote, you need to know this morning it was dark, wet, and cold in Geneva, so the people who made it are very committed, but I'm very happy to have you remotely as well. We will cut the hybrid meeting at 10:45. Many of you will then go to the end forum, but if you still have an hour to spare for debriefing in the room, you can stay. We will be around until 11:45. So that's today, and with this, I think I can hand over. The meeting will be recorded, particularly the first panel, which I can imagine for others who cannot be here today will be interesting as well. With this, I hand over to Dan, who will be moderating the panel. Thank you.
So much, Doro. Actually, I'm the only one without a mic here.
Oh, that's not ideal.
There we go. I just realized that. Well, thanks so much, Doro. And when Doro asked me to do this, she says you had one job. Get as much out of the panel as possible, but do it within 45 minutes. So I'm going to make sure that we hit that mark and really just say only one word about the topic, and that is that it's about teaching human rights, but it's about doing this in a challenging environment. And I want to emphasize that it's not about whether we should teach human rights in business schools, right? Because we'd be talking to the choir, I think, if that's what it was about. Instead, it's about how to do it meaningfully, how to do it effectively in an environment where there are lots of competing pressures. So we're going to start by talking about those competing pressures. I'm not going to introduce the panel up front. Doro's already introduced half, I think. But as we go, I think the group will get to know each of the panelists. But we'll start with Kirsten. Kirsten Waltenberg is head of human rights at the Volkswagen Group. Now, you took the lead at the human rights lead at Volkswagen in 2022. It's a pretty challenging time when people talk about global supply chains, for example, but your remit was even broader than that, to be an ambassador for human rights. And I don't know enough about the Volkswagen Group, but I know it's very complicated. With more than 1,000 separate units, I think 64,000 suppliers, if I understand things correctly. So it's a very complex environment. So, what does the pressure feel like, look like in a company like Volkswagen when it comes to human rights? And if you could just move very quickly into, what kinds of human rights literacy would you like to see in the type of team you were building?
And all of that in 2 minutes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Talking about pressure, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I represent the Volkswagen Group. It's 2,500 entities that are controlled and 700 that are non-controlled. We are very large. Lots of people think they know Volkswagen, but they don't understand that it encompasses Bugatti, Bentley, Skoda, Porsche, Audi, MAN, Scania, and many, many more that we own. So it's very large. It's 700,000 employees. We are the largest corporation in Europe and, of course, then in Germany. And we have 85,000 tier one suppliers, below which there are sometimes up to 30 steps. And a Golf, the normal incinerator car, has 2,500 parts. So you can imagine the vast mass of suppliers that we try to wrap our arms around. You put it correctly. I started in the year that the Ukraine war started, and I try to come up with a sentence, given the time that I'm allocated, to describe the role that I'm in. So you take into account what I just told you, and you think about operational units that have to buy parts, components, all types of parts, from the tiniest bit that cost a few cents to the bigger ones that are the batteries, for example. They have to put them together in production, and then they have to sell them with profit. And you have to imagine it sort of like in the Stone Age, a group of peers that goes hunting for a mammoth, and then compliance, legal, and the human rights officer comes and says, oh, the spears aren't sustainably sourced. Some of the hunters may be having a criminal background, and by the way, we need an agreement between you two so that you know which parts of the mammoth goes to you, and so that's kind of the role. There's no pressure at all. And what I would like to see taught in the business schools is exactly that. It is a necessary role, because if it turns out that the spears weren't sustainably sourced, there are sure to be media people, there are sure to be rating agencies, there are sure to be civil society members. I do not get buckets of mail every week, but I do get a lot of mail. And I get a lot of media requests for interviews and things as such. You will hardly find any of them because I try to take my role in the background more than up front. But it's tangible losses when, for example, rating agencies due to human rights ranks us down. It costs a lot of money in PR and other things if a civil society member publishes a report that is called, for example, some groups that are for sale because they're being sold into slavery. Then the pictures, I don't have to tell you about the pictures and what they do to your business if there is a Volkswagen car and next to it is some people suffering. So in a nutshell, staying within my 2 minutes, that's...
It's rather intense.
Isn't it?
Yeah, much more so than I even envisioned with the 63,000 suppliers. The 85 is crazy, but we're going to come back to that in a second. Michael, from your vantage point at the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but also because of your experience with USAID prior to that in Latin America, have you seen the environment and expectations as it relates to human rights change? And in particular, what we're interested in is what you think business educators most often miss about the shifts that are occurring.
Great. Well, thanks, Stan, for the question. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm, as you said, fairly new at OACHR, but know from colleagues that are a lot of friends and supporters of our business and human rights work in this room. So it's really, really wonderful to join the conversation, and hope to see many of you at the forum the coming few days. The common thread, I think, between those experiences is that we ignore business at our peril. From a development perspective, we know that for development solutions to scale, they have to be market-based. From an international human rights perspective, it's, I think, long been clear that upholding the dignity of individuals and communities is premised on the roles that various constituencies and stakeholders play, importantly, business among them. And so what I think has become clear, perhaps in the last few years, is that we've moved definitively from expectations on business that are grounded in philanthropy or CSR to really a convergence around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence and reporting is the new baseline. From Europe to Latin America to Asia, we see the conversation changing from should companies care to how are they preventing harm across their value chain, and even how can states, how can governments oblige them to take these things into account. A lot of this has been focused recently, of course, on the conversation in Brussels, but we see movement everywhere from South Korea to Thailand to Indonesia to Colombia. Now, I think we should acknowledge challenges, I think, is in the title of this session, so it's not one-way travel. Certainly, these things are rarely linear in any area of public policy, and I think this is an example of that. But if you look at the 5, 10, certainly 20-year sweep, we're clearly heading in a particular direction. If you look at things over 3 or 6 months, maybe it looks a little bit messier. But certainly, from the perspective of business education, I think we would argue that the task really is to prepare students for a world in which compliance with human rights-based standards is fast becoming a legal and a financial expectation.
Well, that kind of complexity, going back to Kirstein's initial framing, is pretty important too, right? That when you talk about this compliance and the globalness of this. But I want to just jump to the second mic, right? Mike, it's been a pleasure talking with you about your book several times. But the one thing I want to point to for this conversation is the motto of the Center for Business and Human Rights at Stern School, and that is pro-business, high standards. How has this framing helped you and your colleagues to embed responsibility and human rights in the business curriculum?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thank you all for being here. I think it's critical for us, at least, in a business school and dealing with future business leaders to recognize that there is a real value for business to operate and to operate globally. I am always saying to my students that the biggest change in human rights in the last 50 years is the reduction in global poverty, especially in East Asia, South Asia. And that's a product more than anything else of jobs. And so if you start from that perspective, then the question is, how do you navigate a globalized world in a way that both allows companies to be profitable, but at the same time to act responsibly? So that's an easier, I think for businesses, it's easier to start with that frame. And frankly, as business educators, if we're trying to educate the next generation of business leaders, we don't want them to be basically advocating that the economic system be thrown up in the air. We have to start with the notion there is a market-based system, and the question is how to make it better, and especially at a time, I can say, in the United States, where our own government is stepping backwards. I think it's doubly important for business educators and businesses to be thinking, how do we step up and maintain rule of law, stability, predictability, democratic norms that underlie basically a healthy business environment?
Thanks, Mike. That's very helpful. But I'm wondering now, this is the time when Vasanthi magically appears on the screen. Do we have Vasanthi? Srinivasa from Bangalore?
Yes.
Hey, Dan.
Hey,
Well,
what, she won't appear on the screen? Oh, there she is. Great, thank you. I was getting a little worried. It's nice to see you, Vasanthi. Now, you've studied ethics education in South Asia, in India, right? What are the unique circumstances that, or challenges in the region that shape the way human rights is taught?
I think there are 3 or 4 things happening in simultaneity, and I think we've got to recognize that they are all legitimate by themselves, and yet how do we have a conversation on human rights in a way that makes sense for various people? So the first one, if you look at it, there's still deep-rooted philanthropic traditions. And if you look at the composition of the businesses in South Asia, and I'm going to emphasize on India a little more, largely family-owned businesses, large number of them small and medium, many of them a part of domestic supply chains of large corporations, and a few of them on the global supply chains. So at every point in time, the tensions between the philanthropic orientations, which is important given the extent of inequality and poverty that exists in these countries, extremely important, but that tends to come in the way of looking at ethics and corporate responsibility. The blurring of the boundaries still continues, and we had a conversation across educators a few months ago in South Asia who are talking corporate responsibility. And I think even getting this idea that stakeholders and how do you actually place them at the center of conversations is still continues to be a challenge, whatever we may talk about ethics education. The second one in the midst of all of this is the global supply chains and the human rights due diligence and the kind of emphasis from a compliance perspective. And I kind of liked what Kristen was talking about in terms of how do you get suppliers compliant. But the interesting thing is it just compliance that we want across Asia? And in a society that's so heterogeneous, how does compliance go with commitment? How do the legal and the regulatory frame inform and just enable for a conversation on human rights? I think that's the second set of challenges. And last but not the least, I think the word human rights itself is so difficult to bring to the table. And given the varied construction and interpretation of these narratives, Dan, it seems like we coexist in 3 or 4 worlds in simultaneously as countries. And I think that's the reality in which business school teachers have to operate and navigate, and more on that in the next round.
Thanks so much, Vasanthi. And I think we also have Solange on the video. Do we? From South Africa, I think in Johannesburg at the moment, right?
I'm here, I'm in Cape Town. I just in my video on, someone else is going to, I think.
So you've returned from the G20, you're back at home in Cape Town. It's nice to hear you. We cannot see you though, I guess we won't see you, but I want to pick up where...
I had my one, but someone else is controlling my camera on that side and said, oh, there we go. Said they would help me. Okay, great. Can you see me?
It's nice to see you again after recently in Ghana at our conference, where we talked a lot about innovation and entrepreneurship. And I want to pick up there with you. Innovation drives business, as we know, and we've entered this new age of innovation with AI. And it has even broader, I think, social implications than many of us even realize at this point. But how should we think about the relationship between innovation and human rights, especially in emerging economies like South Africa?
So, as you all know, we had the G20 and I attended the B20 last week. And so it's great timing. Thanks for inviting me to speak here. The themes, I'm sure, I assume that the world was watching what was happening in South Africa around the G20 and the B20. And the themes there were solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And I think that they very much frame how it is that we see macroeconomic policy as well as the role of business and government in society in this day and age. And at the business school where I teach and work, we talk about the concept of inclusive innovation, which is related to human rights in the sense that it is around how innovation impacts on rights and dignity and social justice. And so inclusive innovation is more conceptually around the participation and inclusion of those who are the beneficiaries or the clients or the customers of innovation. And we talk about a ladder of inclusivity, from identifying needs together to creating solutions together, to creating impact and then transferring knowledge and institutional power. And an example of that in, as you say, the tech space and AI space, which is so critical at this point in time, is actually around a case, a book that we're launching. We're supporting Professor Eldred Jordan to launch in the next few days. He's written a book on the Silicon Empire versus social impact, which is around a platform that he developed called GovChat, that was based on WhatsApp. And during COVID, in order for people in South Africa to access social grants, like for urgent needs like food security, etc., as well as COVID vaccines and information on COVID. So this platform was built off WhatsApp. And then WhatsApp, because it's owned by Meta, was regulating what could and couldn't be used on that platform when it was a service from a government sector, and had other role players in designing and putting it on the WhatsApp platform. So the book is really about how does business support inclusive innovation? How does the private sector work together with the public sector in either making rights accessible or services accessible, or whether it's about accountability or access to information. And I think that it's a really great case study. Hopefully you'll all see the book somewhere and read it. But it's a great case study around inclusive innovation and human rights. And my last point is just going to be that in South Africa, and our constitutional framework on social, economic rights and civil and political rights applies both horizontally and vertically, which means that it doesn't just apply between the state and citizens, it also applies across between private citizens themselves. So the application of human rights is very much entrenched in our constitutional framework as well. And I think that is probably enough for me.
All right, thanks, Solange. You know, we're going to continue our global tour here in a second round, a very quick round, but focus instead of on the pressures, the intense pressures that we're facing, and the shifts that we're seeing in the compliance and the way we think about business and the context of South Asia and South Africa, but focus a little bit more on the way we teach. And I want to start with you, Kirstine, with it sounds to me it's the last thing you need in terms of complexity, but I'm wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about how you see potential collaborations between Volkswagen and business schools in a global environment.
Well, apart from the obvious, where I think it's an expectation from businesses like ours that business schools educate future leaders on the impacts that I addressed earlier. that students understand that human rights infringements is not something that just happens, but what is the consequence of them? If you asked any business leaders around the world whether they want to tolerate human rights infringements in their supply chains or operations, they will all answer in the negative, of course not. But when you tell them it does happen, there is usually a two-way reaction. Either it's rejection, no, it can't be, the denial part, or they wonder how it could happen. And the part of how it could happen is one important factor that I think business schools can teach. I think both of my colleagues to my right have done a wonderful job in the past of extracting some of the causes for that, and other business schools can follow suit. We have people from Asia, we have people from Africa, but I can tell you that human rights abuses do not just happen in the global south, but rather, especially due to the changes that you addressed earlier, in Central and Eastern Europe we see a lot of that, as for example a consequence of the refugee wave from the Ukrainians. So in my practice I see a lot of Ukrainian refugees being exploited. I see them in services and in types of work that they never chose, that they have been pushed into because they were a desperate seek of help themselves. And anywhere in the world where you see human rights abuses, it's either a state-impacted one or it's coming out of poverty. And so addressing the causes and exploring what drives people to abuse human rights, what is the chain of consequence before and after, I think is an important fact. So that business leaders better understand the root causes and where to address them, that it's not enough to just go out there and build some schools in Africa and have a nice sustainability report somewhere. But to understand that there is alternatives to what's happening and how to address them jointly, because it's a universal global legal principle that you're responsible for what you can influence. And this is, by the way, also what the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act addresses. It holds us responsible as German businesses for what happens in our supply chains. And I think without knowing where it's coming from, you can't really address the consequences.
Well, that complexity in a global context, this is very interesting when I think about this, because what I think you're saying is also with business schools, one of the things I like is that there's a business school everywhere, right? So when we talk about what's happening in Eastern Europe, when you talk about South Africa and India, and how do we think about the context and how it fits a global organization like Volkswagen? Thanks for sharing that. But I want to ask a similar question for you, Michael, in a different context, right? With USAID and now the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. How do you think about collaborations with business schools? Because I imagine you're more accustomed to thinking about law schools and policy schools. How do you think about business schools and what do you need to do? What do business schools need to do to build such collaborations?
Great. Yeah. So I think, broadly speaking, the task is to connect global standards, namely the UNGPs, with operational realities. And you're right. Our bread and butter is more. In terms of how we would engage with the academic ecosystem is more naturally, law schools, policy schools, and so forth. But that I think needs to change and evolve, and it has. So let me offer just maybe 3 examples or 3 ideas on how we can do this. From a kind of pedagogical perspective, we of course would encourage business schools to use the materials we've developed on business and human rights, but equally to provide feedback to us about how student-friendly or not those materials are. From the giggles in the room, I suspect the answer is fairly not, so clearly some room for work and conversation there. A second idea would be to take advantage of the UN internship programs, the UN University volunteer framework. That can happen in Geneva, but maybe more interestingly, it can happen in Africa and Latin America, where we have actually significant programs programs running on responsible business conduct. And I think both for us to benefit from the unique perspectives and expertise that business school students bring, but also then vice versa. That's a an opportunity that I think we can explore further. And then finally, the area of research where developing vivid real life case studies can be maybe part of the answer to that challenge of making these standards operationally real for students and practitioners alike, but also, frankly, and going back to the challenges and the pushback, needing to continually strengthen and articulate the business case for business and human rights.
Yeah, that's very nice that you bring up the research part, because it's something that we don't often talk enough about, that connection between the research and the teaching. Mike, you've been visiting a lot of business schools, talking about your book. How many have you visited in the last
17.
70?
17.
Oh, 17. I thought it was. In these visits, you've learned a lot about what the schools are doing. Can you give us 2 or 3 examples of schools that you think are really moving the needle when it comes to business and human rights?
Sure. One thing that to me is very exciting, and we talked about it at this meeting last year, is to begin to think about localizing these discussions to each region. And we worked with the ILO and with the Qatar Business School to come up with some case studies. They looked at the case studies we had done at NYU and said, these are nice, but they don't really reflect our local reality. So they've done now a dozen case studies. Hopefully we're going to see that published in the coming months. And there are 14 business schools in the MENA region that are going to be the recipients of those case studies in English and Arabic. I think we can see the potential to do that in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. There really is a need for us to take this conversation from the broad international conversation to really applying it in practice in different places. Second thing, I see a number of schools. I've been to MIT 3 times, to Sloan. One of the things we've talked about there is making the case studies much more relevant. I think, and this is a broader critique of business education, I think the Harvard case studies have been seen their day, frankly. They're too slow. They're not contemporary. They're too much like a Disney movie. There's always a happy ending. I think we need to actually have real-life studies that evaluate real challenges, again, without the right or wrong answer, but really in a short amount of time convey to students, these are hard questions, and give them either with case studies or role play ways to really look at the ethical dimensions of what business is about. MIT is doing that in a really interesting way. And finally, I would say Doro and I have done a lot on the research side. Again, Michael mentioned that. We need to move from theory to practice. We need to look at both how we talk to governments and companies, not only evaluating what's going on, but making practical recommendations for how they ought to be operating differently. So I think there's, again, a research function that merges the academic, the theoretical, with practically how do we get business to do a better job on these issues.
Yeah, I've heard that many times in the last several weeks, actually, that one way that we could do a better job with teaching things like human rights in business schools is to do a better job with research. And I appreciate that. Vasanthy, you're welcome to comment on anything you've heard so far, but I'd love to also hear, because you're in Bangalore, I'd love to hear your perspectives on things like the impact of globalization with India, but also technology, given where you're embedded at the IIM in Bangalore.
So I think just talking from my school and our perspective, and I also want to leave with a bit of an innovation on what I've tried to attempt to do over the last couple of years in terms of how you frame business and human rights. I think clearly the first shift that we are seeing is much more integration of environment and environmental issues into from 2 perspectives. One is clearly the risk perspective of the corporation, which is kind of getting highlighted quite significantly. But the other one, I think, for us is really conversations on who is impacted by climate changes. It's the poor, the vulnerable. So those conversations are kind of becoming more center stage in the context of corporations and their duties. The second kind of conversations that are happening is clearly with the manner in which generative AI companies in India have just allowed the telecom operators to provide OpenAI services for free. So as we speak, Perplexity has tied up with a partner and OpenAI has now opened up free OpenAI. In the midst of all this are conversations of three kinds on technology. One is the whole piece on transparency, digital. What is the kind of data you're capturing? It's no longer digital divide. I think the conversations are substantive with phishing attacks and who's getting impacted. So I think the banking sector, the fintech companies, all of them, we are having some of those conversations. Regulators are coming in very strongly, particularly on violations on citizens' rights. I think that's one kind of a conversation. The second conversation, what many yet nascent but is evolving very quickly, is that the kind of water table depletion that we are going to see with increased data centers getting located. Apart from this is, of course, what generative AI and this embracing by all organizations is kind of posing as water table risks. So that's another piece of conversation that's happening sitting here in Bangalore. And of course, much larger conversations on the ethical dilemmas and how do we equip managers to do critical thinking, whether it is on the news that they get or in the way they are getting employees to embrace technologies. Clearly, we are seeing a lot of job losses in the last 1.5 years. So all in all, I think the external environment is just ripe for deep conversations on human rights. So let me just take a minute more and then talk about something that I decided last year, that conversations on business and human rights is not going to be at the level of students and look at executives, but really not the implementers, but how much do boards understand on business rights, business and human rights. And so we decided to take this into an independent director certification course that we are running. Till 3 years ago, I framed this as a responsible business problem. But last year, we just took it into the rooms and said, whose rights are you violating? Clearly quite provocative, and there was a lot of backlash. And the assumption that top management and boards know about business and human rights, I think that's something that we as business school faculty have to challenge those assumptions. I don't think they know. I think what they are fed is a business perspective, not a sustainability or a social and ethical perspective. And I must confess that the last 2 rounds of teaching has been extremely rewarding, both for me as well as the participants, because I think that's a route to discovery. And what we did was tie that up with an assignment where they had to provide recommendations to their boards on what they think are the human rights issues that their organizations are grappling with. And I think 25% of the participants just went back and presented to their board members. And I think that, to me, is extremely insightful. So what do I take away as an educator? That I think it's not enough to sensitize our students, not enough to sensitize implementers, but I think we really have to play an active role in sensitizing the boards. And that's not something that I've heard too many conversations on. Let me stop here. Thank you. Over to you, Dan.
Well, you've put a lot out for us to think about in that short period of time. And I like how you turned a previous comment on its head. And in fact, it's not just the research informing the teaching, but it's the teaching informing the research and how we discover and develop new insights. But I also appreciate your connection to these other challenges. We often think of climate as a science challenge, but it's really a different S. It's a social challenge. So, Lange, I want to press you on a slightly different question that we may have intended to, but a lot of this work that business schools do, I think, can benefit more from the institution for which they're part, right? So many business schools are part of universities, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, in addition to picking up on some of your work with entrepreneurs.
Sure. So the Bertha Center that I run and the solution space are both entrepreneurial and innovation hubs with a focus on social justice and human rights. And we exist within the business school, but the Vice Chancellor, who started about a year ago at the University of Cape Town, has also decided that innovation and entrepreneurship should be a cross-cutting theme across the entire university, supporting all faculties, all disciplines at both undergraduate and graduate levels. So it's definitely growing as a thematic focus, but also being acknowledged that entrepreneurial skills and an innovative mindset can benefit everybody within a university environment, as well as helping to grow the economy, create jobs in an economic time in South Africa where growth is limited, jobs are not growing as much as there is a demand and need as young people enter the labor market. So entrepreneurship is being seen a little bit as a silver bullet, which it's not necessarily, I don't think. But those skills that we can impart to young people and at a graduate and postgraduate level can certainly help people to think, even if they are not setting up their own businesses, that they can be entrepreneurial within existing businesses or within existing institutions, which we call intrapreneurial. And so I think that the link back to the original question you had asked me, the link within business schools, trying to develop not just entrepreneurial mindsets as well as skills, but also linking into broader ecosystems as part of the work that we do. So a couple of examples. So we don't only have an MBA curriculum at the business school, we also offer a Master's in Philosophy and Inclusive Innovation, as well as an MCOM in Development Finance. So those are the master's programs at the University in Cape Town, and we also provide scholarships as the Bertha Center for some MBA students and some MPhil students if they have a social impact purpose driven mandate or emphasis. And then we provide support and as alumni, as a community in an ongoing way. And so over the years, an example of one of our alum set up a health enterprise and establishing smart lockers in clinics all over the country where people could get access to their medicines in a very quick way rather than standing in long queues. And this is being rolled out in partnership with the public health system. And so Neo Hutiri is a great case study, if I can call him that, of having gone through a business school curriculum, MPhil, done his research paper, and then established this network of a health enterprise. We are also, I think I already mentioned before, we're part of this broader MasterCard Foundation Health Entrepreneurship Collaborative across 8 African universities, where we are trying to support the education of entrepreneurs with a social impact, as well as link them into private sector funding, whether it's venture capital or catalytic capital, depending on what phase they're at, and then also linking them into, obviously, into the public health system. So that ecosystem support is also really important. I could talk about this for hours, but so I don't know if that's it.
Thank you, Solange. It's a brilliant close to I think a diverse round of discussion about what business schools are doing, but also how they're responding to the pressures that companies face globally. So, back to you, Doro. I think we made it within the 45 minutes. In fact, we put us back on track. I wish that we would have left a little bit of time for discussion around the room, but we'll have some time for that, I think, as we go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Let's clap. Yeah. I greatly enjoyed the stock taking around the world, across disciplines, and how we as educators can navigate increasing complexity and bring it to the classroom and into our research. With this, I want to turn to the second cluster of today's agenda, namely our research clusters. I said we will highlight the work of 3, and I want to start with the Human Rights and Tech cluster, which made a fresh start under Björn's and Mariana's leadership. Mariana, my colleague at NYU Stern. Björn is here today. Mariana's on maternity leave since last weekend, so Björn will brief us. Over to you, Björn.
Yes, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. So yes, this group, this research cluster has been quite active actually with the help of Mariana. So I don't know if she's watching, if she can watch. So I hope you're all as well with you, Mariana. She was very, very, very helpful in getting we had a good mailing list, but just getting the people together, and that was very important. So we had, since last year, we had 3 meetings, which is pretty good. One more get-together meeting, but then we had 2 substantive meetings, which is very good. The first one was about techno-realism. So instead of talking about AI or even computers, these are blurry words that somehow complicate the human rights discussion. We start with hardware and command language, several layers of command language running on hardware, communicating to us through some kind of devices like screens or so. So that's the starting point, and not AI. And that brings up a whole new bunch of questions. So the techno-realist approach is not too bad to start with when we want to decipher human rights issues. And the second meeting was a case study that I think was prepared by Mariana, very interesting case study about a company that, a typical example of technology solving a problem that was caused by technology. You know, so we have the problem of online bullying in the gaming industry, and this is one of the good uses of large language models or somehow language recognition, where we can in fact spot this bullying and do something effectively about it. So what unites us in this tech cluster is we distillated two topics that we find quite interesting. First is the human rights language appropriate for technology? Is the common approach through human rights due diligence, the risk-based approach, does it work? We don't think so. So I don't have time to, but please come to me and I'll explain my position a little bit more. Of course it works for things like algorithmic bias or privacy violations, but for many things it doesn't work. And the second thing is that that we're thinking about is why is our participatory, participatory governance has been around for a very long time, and there have been many efforts, but they don't really work either. So we're trying to identify why is participatory governance and technology not working, what we can do to make it better. So these are the two strands of thought that we are discussing in our cluster meetings, and I hope we'll follow up with them, and I very much hope that Mariana will be. I know that she has many others, but maybe she'll be back. I'll try to keep it going, and hope that we can continue with this. And I hope we'll have some output for students. All of our sessions are being recorded, so all of the participants. It somehow inhibits maybe people to speak, but at the same time we have material that can be used as case studies, like the one that Mariana presented, that can be, and it's free, yeah, so everybody, it's a very good case study to use in the classroom. And also to talk about a techno-realist approach is also very helpful, so that we can use all this recordings that can be used by everybody in the group. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And the case study, we will share it, of course, at our newsletter, and everything else you can share, please send it centrally to the team of Dan, who puts together our newsletter. So thanks for that. Anyone interested in joining this thematic cluster on human rights and tech, to Björn or to us, we can direct you. Charles, over to you. Supply chains.
Thank you, Doro. And hi, everyone. I'd like to go back to some of the things that were shared earlier, and in particular, moving from the case method to more experiential and clinical type of education. Some of you have said it's time in 2025 to do that. Actually, the Dean of Harvard said that in 2012, He wrote a very interesting piece about what business education can learn from medical teaching, talking about his visit to India and reflecting on how business schools could maybe introduce clinical education alongside theoretical teaching. And so that's one of the things I've done this year. The Geneva Center came out with a toolkit about their own experience doing clinical education, clinical business and human rights education, and so I introduced that in my own business school at HEC, and it was a really interesting experience. Also, kind of echoing what some of you have said, so in practice, it's about going to a company. In this case, it was Schneider Electric, which is slightly smaller than Volkswagen, but still has 56,000 tier 1 suppliers. And what they were interested in is they were saying, we're quite good at doing a power socket, which you can find in this room, the typical white power socket. And we've done quite a big effort to make sure that there is almost no forced labor in this power socket, as much as we can guarantee. But we don't know how to transfer that information to the consumer. And we don't know if there is any willingness to pay any type of premium for a power socket that would have a good performance with regards to forced labor or other types of human rights indicators. And so 6 students. I'd like to say that some of you might think HEC Paris is a French business school. I don't really consider it as a French business school anymore. We have 139 nationalities. So when I opened this clinic to my students, it was a student from Afghanistan, a student from Japan, a student from Spain, and 3 French students. Okay, but it was still quite global and quite interesting to see the diversity. So we published the results of this clinic, but that's kind of GBSN in practice. So Doro developed a pedagogic answer to Harvard's former dean question, and now it's being transferred and moved around from Europe and maybe elsewhere. The second thing I did, one of the challenges we were talking with other research cluster leads is that GBSN by nature is very global. So we're quite good at doing online meetings, but quite frustrated at meeting online because across different time zones, and we don't have the tech support we have today. It's not always that easy to actually go beyond the pleasure of meeting and some good ideas, but actually put them in practice. So last year we had the High Commissioner for Human Rights talking about maybe opportunities for our network to connect with regional forums. And so I worked to organize a student event on the sidelines of a Business and Human Rights Forum. That was the Asia Pacific Regional Forum in Bangkok in September. And so in a matter of a couple of days, we launched an invitation to business schools through the GBSN network, and we had about 20 teams from over 10 countries coming to Bangkok to compete in a business and human rights hackathon. So it was really interesting. Solange was there. I don't know what she was doing in Bangkok, preparing for the Johannesburg G20 meeting maybe. But no, it was really great to actually meet in person with some of the cluster members. And so that's already also been published. It's in the formal report of the Bangkok Regional Business and Human Rights Forum. It was also very interesting to see, so I told you about what it's like when you ask companies what they concretely want students to work on. I remember in this hackathon we had a case, we had 4 cases, algorithmic management for gig workers, we had one on sustainable palm oil production, working and implementing FPIC procedures in mining activities with indigenous communities, and the last one was on the reliance of the soda and water industry on virgin plastic. And we had a team from Mongolia suggesting to implement a platform in Mongolia where recycled virgin plastic would be used for insulation of yurts. And that was really, I mean, very curious. The jury were all kind of senior speakers coming to the forum, and they really didn't expect that at all, and they found it really clever and interesting. And so, Daniel, we're talking about the localized dimension. I think none of us would imagine, transforming virgin plastic into insulation for yurts. But I mean, the Mongolian students were quite convinced about it. And actually, last week they were holding their first Business and Human Rights student conference in the National Science and Technology University of Ulaanbaatar. So that's great. I wish I was there, but couldn't make it. So yeah, we're trying to do things. I tried to organize, and we thought about it with Doro, a little student hackathon. Maybe we can do that next year. It's going to be the 15th edition of the forum, and more importantly, the 10th edition of our meeting. So I think it would be great. It does require a bit of organizing, but I think we can pull in maybe 50, 60 students to come to Geneva. And it would be great to have, some of our students attend, participate, and really build solutions, maybe some of them, addressing questions provided by the private sector, or by, organizations like OHCHR as well. So yeah, that's it for our cluster.
Excellent. First of all, I love that you started copying the clinic that we piloted here in Geneva. We currently run one here as well. And it's my colleague Berit Knaak who leads those clinics. And it's the 6th clinic, I believe, and they just go exceptionally well. And it's such a concrete way to increase the private sector and the students. And from the hackathon, I mean, we really see how this inspires students to develop solutions, to self-organize. So I absolutely want to see if we can do that in Geneva next year, counting on all your help, of course. And I do believe the UN forums around the world, and that's something we've discussed with the office before, are sort of logical points where people come together anyway, and we should attach some specific work on human rights and business school education to them, maybe even a hackathon. So, yeah, counting on all of you. All right, let's move on to the human rights and accounting cluster. For a long time, we've discussed how can we bring human rights to sort of the standard program at business schools. Accounting is a standard course taught in all programs. John and Yingre have been leading this work in our network for many years. Please turn over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So the most recent initiative that Yingre and I have led on is to undertake a survey of the research cluster members, along with members of the Centre for Social and Environmental Accounting Research. So around 450 participants, well, we sent the survey to about 450 people. We got about 45 responses, which wasn't great, but it was okay. And that was on around the challenges of implementing business human rights in the accounting curriculum, with some opportunity to talk about innovations in practice as well. We hope to follow that up. So 10 of those respondents have indicated a willingness to take part in follow-up conversations. And from that, we hope to develop a report whereby we identify the challenges of integrating accounting and finance, or business and human rights into the accounting and finance program, and also to come up with some case studies and best practice. So we'll start that process of speaking with people early next year. And hopefully, by the summer at least, we'll have a report. But one thing, just while everyone's here and there's people online, most of the people in the network are from an accounting background, and I think it would be great if we could expand that and bring more finance people into the picture. So if there's anyone here in finance, please join the cluster. Superb. Excellent. Also, you might not have completed the survey, but if you want to take part in a follow-up conversation, by all means get in touch with me as well. That would be great.
Thank you so much, and I consider your work as, you're creating a model for how to assess the current status of human rights in the accounting discipline, and then how can you advance human rights through teaching and research in accounting. And what you do in accounting, I wish others would do in marketing. You mentioned expand to finance, but also supply chain management. I mean, these are courses taught on a routine basis in every program at every business school. How can that human rights dimension and that lens be filtered into those existing courses? Anything you can do to sort of model how to truly embed this dimension would be helpful for many other subdisciplines of management as well. So thank you so much. I think at this point we should take a pause and get a couple more reactions and questions from the group before we move on to the third cluster. Should we take 5, 7, 8 minutes for anything that may come up from your side? If not, we're moving on. But is there some? Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the interesting conversation. I'm Clemens Hering from the FAU Nuremberg, Airline Nuremberg. And my question would be on the intersection between human rights topics and environmental topics, because there's, of course, now coming up this issue of human rights and environmental due diligence. So how far can we lean towards that without blurring the analytical scope? Because there's also a lot of learnings, actually, in terms of governance from human and environmental rights. Thank you.
Just briefly react. So for completeness, we had highlights of 3 research clusters now, but I want to mention the other 4 that we have. One on extractives, another one on climate, another one led by Lara on gender, and a cluster of working around topics in agriculture led by Berit. So across those clusters, one specifically dedicated to climate and human rights, but I would say across the clusters, this question of the intersection between climate and human rights keeps coming up. And Vasanti mentioned it earlier in the panel, clearly highlighting environmental topics lead, but they have implications on people. So the intersection is there. Does someone else want to react? Here we go.
Just a quick added reaction to what Doro said. There's clearly lots of overlap and needs to be more. The 2 fields have operated on parallel tracks, not integrated. There's some ways in which some of the environmental priorities actually complicate human rights, and we need to be aware of that. Doro's done all the work on cobalt mining, which is a byproduct of trying to deal with electric vehicles as an alternative to fossil fuels. We have the solar panels in Xinjiang. So there's lots of examples. But there's also, I think, a lot of opportunities to think about how the environmental agenda, which has been so dominant, can integrate human rights as an element of what is going on. Climate justice, people talk about. Just transition is another phrase. I think there's a lot of opportunity for people in the human rights world to be integrating with an environmental movement which is bigger and stronger, and where, frankly, companies have an easier time finding the way in. We don't want it to be marginalized, though, and that's the challenge. That one you say, okay, this is all about environment, and the human rights issues get second place or aren't talked about at all.
Any other comment or reaction, or can we move on? There will be more space in the end, but okay. All right.
This is blinking. You can hear me now. My name is Milda. I'm based at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. We have one of the biggest student bodies in mainland Europe, so this is all extremely relevant. Thank you so much. And I don't know if my question can be easily answered, but you kept touching upon bringing research and teaching together. And I want to face the reality as a faculty member. The only incentives for most faculty members are to publish in top-tier journals that barely have a paragraph on practical implications, if any, and usually not very useful for people like Kirsten. So the only research outlets for teaching that I can think of are practice-oriented journals like HBR or Sloan Management Review, California Management Review, but they're still very narrow in scope. The only things I use in my executive MBA courses are books. Michael, thank you so much. It's been amazing. I use chapter after chapter from your book and many others. So any other thoughts of, and maybe this is a system question and almost a rhetorical question, but are there practical thoughts on how to really link research to teaching when the incentives are a bit off maybe?
You're describing an issue that we're all really familiar with. I think we need everything. We need foundational research that is published in academic journals, but I hope the people who develop the foundational research still find a pocket of time to also translate their research for a more practitioner-oriented audience. So basically, the insights can be, I think, prepared for different audiences and different outlets, including, and I think this is what we've been trying to do, every research report has been translated into a teaching tool, into a scenario or a full case study, so that we make sure that the research insights find their way back into the classroom and into our teaching. Someone else? Also, anyone else from the audience?
Just one quick added thought on this. People use the word disruption a lot. I think part of what we're really thinking about and talking about is being disruptive in terms of business teaching models, and that includes research. And so if you're trying to get a peer-reviewed journal to look at what you're doing, it's going to be really hard. And if you're on a track towards tenure, that's still the path. I can't change that. But it doesn't mean you can't do research outside of that world. I think we've published close to 40 reports. We call it translational research. We do it ourselves. We publish it ourselves. It has a life of its own. And there's no reason why that can't be replicated again and again. We need to get information out there that's solid academic analysis tied to practical suggestions and recommendations. That's what the business community longs for. It's what the public wants to read. They want to read things that they understand. And if it's not going to be published in an A journal, we have to find alternative venues to put that stuff out there.
That question is actually a great transition to our third cluster, which starts with a quick contribution from the Case Center, a platform that hosts so many case studies. We've talked about case studies before, and Vicky, who agreed to join us, had a family emergency, but I'm very happy that Hazel is with us this morning. Just confirming that this is true. Yes, oh, excellent. Hello, Hazel. Thank you for coming on so spontaneously and talking with us about how the Case Center could support us in creating content on business human rights, creating cases that are helpful for your platform and your users.
Brilliant. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here and join you as the last-minute stand-in. Thanks for having me. So just to give a little bit of background about the Case Centre. So our kind of main mission is to advance and promote the case method in business and management education worldwide, so that future managers and leaders can learn from real-world challenges and dilemmas, including those that touch on ethics, responsibility, and human rights. We're going to be really interested to see what materials emerge from this community, because there's obviously enormous potential for cases that bring human rights challenges to life. Students today are not only expecting that, they're demanding to actually engage with those topics, and they want to debate questions of fairness, equity, corporate responsibility in the classroom. And the case method is, and I am a bit biased, and I don't mind saying it, is without a doubt the best kind of vehicle for making that happen. When a student steps into the shoes of the protagonist in the case, whether they're a CEO faced with a supply chain dilemma or a policymaker balancing economic growth with labour rights, they're developing those critical thinking skills, they're developing empathy, ethical reasoning, that are all essential for responsible leadership. So in a nutshell, we're really keen to support and distribute any cases that highlight human rights issues and ensure that they reach our real global audience and network of faculty, schools and students alike.
Excellent. I think at this point, I want to actually ask people in the room if they have questions for you. But while you're thinking about your question, I just want to sort of propose one way that I've been considering engaging with case studies. There are so many case studies out there that are used routinely across all courses, and I would love to look at them and write a case addendum with the specific human rights dimension that is probably not at all highlighted in those existing cases. But I believe I can find a human rights dimension in almost any case study that is taught in the popular classes in the management programs. So I would love to give this a try. It's an idea that we've been discussing for some time. We have yet to develop a template, and we'd be happy to share that, but I'm keen to hear how the case center could support such case addendums, and also what others in the room think about that. And if you would be willing to contribute, ask your colleagues, which case are you teaching in marketing or accounting? And could I look at this case and maybe draft a 1 or 2 pager on the human rights dimension that is often not raised in those classes or that's simply overlooked? I think that's a concrete way to truly embed and bring in a human rights dimension into the existing teaching without changing their program, their material necessarily. Keen to hear what you think, and maybe Hazel, you react first to that.
Well, obviously Vicky very briefly filled me in on email over the weekend about this idea, and it sounds actually fascinating. As you rightly pointed out, not every case is obviously written from a human rights angle, but many of the cases that we'll have in the database probably touch on some of those themes within them, but not explicitly. It's not the main purpose of that case. So I think that what we could do is that those then discussion prompts or these addendums would then be used as another prompt for the faculty so that they could then pick it up and then integrate human rights into their teaching, even perhaps if, like you say, the original case doesn't focus on that as the kind of decision point. I guess from our side, we could potentially host and distribute those addendums, and we could put them as a supplementary teaching resource. And we'd ensure that they're obviously easily accessible so that when faculty actually bought the original case or downloaded it, that then they could just access that as well. So that would then hopefully make it really simple for educators to then bring human rights considerations into any case discussion, which would be great for broadening the impact, raising awareness, and obviously then without the need to then rewrite the case, as you said. So yeah, in summary, it'd be great to collaborate and amplify the work of this community and make sure that we get human rights embedded into management education.
Fantastic. That really motivates me. I hope it motivates you as well to contribute. All right. Anything else from your side to Hazel? Any specific questions about the case center? No, all good. Well, Hazel, thank you so much for joining us. We'll follow up bilaterally for sure. Thank you. All right, next on the agenda is Prime. I just want to provide an update on where Prime currently stands. You may remember, if you've been working with us for a few years, that Mette Morsing, the then director of Prime, reached out to us and said, could we help, since we had our established network on business human rights, to also feed her working group on business human rights, which has been laying dormant for some time. And we said, of course, we can add a Prime affiliation to the work that we've been developing, and also hoping that, and that was Mette's plan, to bridge to the UN Global Compact companies that could certainly make a strong case for human rights in business school education as well. After all, Prime is sort of the little sister of the UN Global Compact. That didn't quite work out, and Mette left, which created a leadership vacuum in Prime for the past 2 years. They have, however, in the meantime, undergone what they call a refresh process for the working groups. now demanding that all working groups assess who's actually leading the group. They require a 50% prime affiliation leadership, so the leaders should come from schools that are not just signing up for prime, but also reporting on prime. They want the the IP of everything we are producing. They want more reporting. So it's a formalization process that the prime working groups are undergoing. And I had a series of conversations with Rachel, Dan, and others over the past weeks to see if you're moving forward with prime. And at this point, we decided we won't sign the Memorandum of Understanding and the Code of Conduct committing to all these additional requirements without a clear vision of prime's future leadership. They have appointed a new leader, but that's not public yet. And still, some of the requirements that we would sign up to are quite unclear. And I've looked at your affiliations with Prime. Many of you are members, but not communicating members to Prime. So it just creates a host of complications. And you may remember that we published this summer a refreshed toolkit on business human rights, and the Prime logo is not on it just because it would have been so complicated. So I think we're moving forward without Prime for now, but instead I'm really keen to explore the idea of creating regional hubs that could come, where groups of regionally close people could come together and advance locally relevant teaching resources, but also possibly joint grant proposals, etc. So we've been in early discussions with Solange in South Africa to see if she could help us build an African network, and also with a school in Brazil. So this is something where I see greater impact going forward than continuing with Prime. That sort of just as an update, and this is something I will have to communicate back to Prime before the end of the year. So if you want to have more conversations about that and also see the documents that they asked us to sign, I'm happy to share that with anyone who feels strongly about Prime or who works at a school that is very invested in Prime. Prime also has so-called affiliated working groups, and I will explore if we can remain in the realm of Prime as an affiliated working group without fulfilling the full requirements that they are now putting on working groups, including reporting requirements that are still quite unclear. All right. Okay. Yes?
No, but, very quickly, just to mention that when we did the hackathon in Bangkok, we established an informal, loosely GBSN-related group of faculty working on business and human rights in the Asia-Pacific region. So we already have a WhatsApp group of about 10, 12 people. And so yeah, that goes, you were talking about Africa and Latin America, but there's potential also to grow a dedicated business and human rights GBSN community in Asia Pacific.
Thanks, and please continue that work with Vasu and others. To us, the Qatar model, we would love to establish it in other regions as well. Next, just another word on this toolkit. Thank you to everyone who contributed. We see two primary uses for this. For you to have start conversations with your dean, with whoever leads in your business school, to create space for what you want to do. Because I know many of you are still struggling with space to teach, space to discuss. So this piece should be a conversation starter. And the other primary use is, of course, use it to give it to colleagues who are not here yet. And bring a friend, as Mike would say, in the future. But again, this could be a conversation starter, and it sort of broadly outlines our theory of change and your testimonies of how you've started the work. So I feel strongly about let's use this toolkit as we have it.
Can I say just one?
Yes, please.
One of the things Dan mentioned, I traveled to a bunch of business schools in North America and Europe, and then most recently in West Africa. One of the things that's really striking is that students really want to get this level, this aspect of business education. A lot of faculty say, we know there's an interest, but we don't know how to teach this. It's not what we do. And so one of the reasons for the toolkit, and what I think this meeting is intended hopefully to convey, is we want to be a resource, both to people in this room on the video, but also your colleagues. Everybody doesn't have to have a center or a dedicated course. It can be an accounting course or a finance course or a supply chain course. And the more we can sort of provide materials or ideas or support to you and your colleagues, that's really what we want to do. We know this is going to be an incremental process. We want to accelerate that by being available to you to help you do it in a way that fits in with your own teaching priorities, your own research, and what your school recommends.
Yeah, so waiting for you feedback. Sure.
Just a very quick thing, because you mentioned the faculty and the syllabus and how difficult it is. I think the way things work in many, at least in the schools I know, is that the input comes from the market and from whether or not, so it should be people like Kerstin who tell business school deans that we need more people who have at least more human rights competencies, who don't have a master in business and human rights, but some kind of human rights education. And if that message comes from the companies to the deans of the business schools, there will be more space in the syllabus. I'm quite sure about that.
I just wanted to say that for those of us who maybe, I work with Johns Hopkins SAIS as an adjunct professor and also with the Bologna Business School in Italy. With what's going on in Brussels, it's actually had a real dampening effect in terms of having any sort of expert. There's a Bologna Business School has a mixture of master's program and also sustainability experts or mid-career. And they're seeing that there's a little bit of a sort of less lowering of interest, and companies are less interested in, or at least they're not feeling that they really need to get on the case. And so I just want to, I'm wondering whether others in the room are feeling that there may be fewer people interested. I know also at Johns Hopkins, there was a 30% shortfall of students signing up for development, climate change, and sustainability. So 30% in 1 year. They know there are no jobs at AID. They know there are no jobs in clean energy. They're thinking very short term and sort of how are we gonna adjust to this?
So since I've been given the word, you know the saying about perception becoming reality if enough people believe in it? I can tell you from a practice point of view, and this is not just Volkswagen speaking, it's not true. Although a lot of people are right now jumping the bandwagon of deregulation due to some geopolitical developments, let's put it this way, the reality is different because of what I said on the outset. Companies, especially large corporations, are very much aware of reputational and other risks accompanied by human rights abuses. And there can be as many joining the choir as they want. The companies are not going to stop. In Germany, we had general elections at the beginning of this year, and one certain party actually won a significant amount of votes due to the fact that they wanted to get rid of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act on false pretenses, by the way, because they claimed it's damaging to small businesses to which it is not applicable. So that was quite frustrating for us as well, but I can reassure you, and of course Volkswagen is not just part of the network of the larger corporations in Germany and Europe, with Schneider Electric being one of them, but also integrated very much into politics. You know, 20% of Volkswagen is owned by the state of Lower Saxony, so I can reassure you it's a perception right now, but it would be dangerous to fall prey to it. It's not true. Businesses are interested in a sustainable way of doing business and not infringing human rights as part of that. So.
Do you want to? Thank you, of course. I haven't experienced that drop-off yet. Teaching at a business school, I think it matters also how you frame it and how you pitch it. you may have followed over the past weeks that there is sort of a surge in the interest of the so-called business case for human rights. I think this conversation needs to be very carefully framed with a lot of nuance, but we are definitely convinced there is a business case in a very broad sense, if we frame it broadly and understand business success broadly, and if we give it sufficient time. So instead of crunching numbers, I think there are ways to explaining why this remains so relevant and arguably is more relevant than ever to students that they are actually joining. So I've not had that problem as of yet.
One of my nasty little colleagues at Bologna Business School, at the Johns Hopkins Center in Bologna, basically said, "You're here teaching ESG skills course? I mean, does that exist anymore?"
Okay, sure, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a particularly difficult moment in the United States, where you have a government that's basically rejected ESG, DEI, you pick your initials, they're against it. But I think what Kirsten says is right. This is, in the longer term, there's going to be some form of regulation. It's not going to be linear. It's not going to happen next year. It's going to happen over time in a range of ways. And the best companies that are going to be around in 10 years are already thinking we better get our act together, and we have to figure out how to actually do these things. And so as educators, our job is to give them and their future colleagues some tools to figure out how to actually improve performance. That's what this is all about. And I think we just have to hold our nerve, those of us that, are across the pond, and recognize this is not forever.
If I may ask, we need to be patient until we have data sets that actually measure human rights performance and not just weak proxies. Sorry, I had to say that. At the end of a heated conversation that was going on over LinkedIn and other platforms in the past weeks. So,
if I can come in quickly, I mean, I think I experience a little bit the same thing, even if, outside of the drop of, I don't witness necessarily the drop of student interest, but I still feel that I'm speaking to students that could learn what they learn in my class outside of my class, so it doesn't make it all that relevant either. But from a practical perspective, I think what our colleague from India was talking about engaging with board certification that some of our universities or our school provide, or typically executive education. I know, in my school, this is something that's quite strong, and it's completely outside of pre-experience education. And I think, as our friend from Volkswagen was saying, there's still a very strong interest, practical interest, especially from SMEs, who I think have the right to be a bit confused about exactly what is expected from them, how expensive human rights, environmental due diligence, extra financial reporting actually is going to cost them. They've been promised so many different things in terms of this is how much it's going to cost you, or no, it's going to be cheap because it's going to become automated, and I think they've become a bit lost, and I don't think they're pushing for deregulation, maybe because they're convinced that they want more human rights violation, but more because they are a bit lost. And I think when I'm preparing a class with executive education, I really look at it completely differently as preparing a class for master's student in terms of what is going to be their expectations, and so I think also that could be a strategic focus if we have limited resources. If we're all just a couple of people who are considered in our universities to be still providing skills that are obsolete, then we need to provide those obsolete skills to the right people.
And maybe just a word on, we appointed a couple of ambassadors from practice. Matthew Kilgariff is here. Yes, and you're an ambassador now. We have Ron Popper as well. So people who are from practice or connected with practice, work with networks of practitioners. I really see a strong role for them to also now highlight, no, we still want this in education. It makes, we want these skills, these leadership skills, broad leadership skills of understanding how the world works and how to navigate those increasing complexities. We want that in the people we hire in the future. So that would be very helpful. All right. Vasanti had put their hand up. She's remote. Should we call on her briefly? Vasanti, is this a good moment for you to come in?
Yes, please. I think I just wanted to pick on Doro's idea on whether the existing cases could do with a little bit of framing from a human rights lens. And thanks, Doro, because I just realized that the 3 cases that I have on the HBS, all of them, I think we should try with an addendum from a business and human rights perspective. And maybe I'll come back next year to report on that for you, on what happens there as we kind of move the needle. But I think there's much that can be done there with our own colleagues, and we can influence them. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much. I can't wait. There's one last point on the agenda, but we can continue the conversation. I asked David Hess to just highlight the fact that what we're doing here, which is open to anyone, but exclusive to business schools. So business school affiliation or teaching to business school students. There are other platforms that are truly interdisciplinary that also have events tonight even, I believe. No? Tomorrow night, okay, the social gathering. So there are other contexts where we can meet each other and even more colleagues that work on business human rights in other disciplines. David, do you want to say a few things about the various ways for others to engage around research and teaching?
Sure. No, I'll try to be very quick. Yeah, so the idea of bringing together research and teaching is exactly relevant to what we do. So the Business Human Rights Teaching Forum have a meeting tomorrow and then a social event in the evening. We, starting last year, many people in the room were there, we started having a joint conference together, the Teaching Forum and the Scholars Association. It was September 2024 in the Netherlands. It'll be in May 2026 in Curitiba, Brazil. We extended the deadline so we could come here and encourage people to attend. So until December 15th, if you'd like to attend the meeting there. So it'll be in person, which gives a chance to see the faces behind the Zoom screens. And an opportunity, by having both the teaching and research together, it gets a chance to bring people together and have those discussions. And if you're in a business school, you get a chance to meet people who are from all the other different schools out there that may not want to come over to the business school sometimes. But it's a place to integrate, understand what's going on. And I said, so the teaching side is not just classroom teaching, but as you mentioned, also clinical teaching as well. We had panels on that in our last meeting. So be on the lookout. We'll figure out where we're going to be in 2027, but you still have time to submit an abstract for May 2026 in Curitiba, Brazil.
And one more word on the Business Human Rights Journal, maybe, because the journal also has a section for development in the field. I think many of you know this here, so it's a clear way to bridge between the academic format and
I didn't want to use the time, but I was going to say that in direct response to the question earlier, right? That is an opportunity to either encourage practitioners to submit, these are shorter pieces on what's going on in practice, as well as maybe a faculty member and somebody from practice can work together to develop something. So Florian, Anita, and Shira, see somewhere, they developed this idea of developments in the field. That's a way to do that. And they're open access, so you can use it freely in all your classrooms as well. So that makes it even easier to get out there.
Thank you, David. Any other business comments, ideas that we should discuss and take?
I just have one.
Yes, please.
Stealing all the last minute. But on, when you're talking about trying to bring in the human rights issues into other areas, for those of us who have been in business ethics for a long time, right, that's the same ethics across the curriculum conversation. So, and as I think people have mentioned, to do that, the people who may be in other disciplines who have this addendum, they need to be able to do it well, right? Because otherwise it can do more harm than good. We've heard a lot of complaints while we've raised these issues, and the faculty member doesn't really know how to do it. So it comes across almost like, well, it's not really that important because I don't understand it. So teaching the teachers is going to be very important on how we do that as well. So just kind of a word of caution. We can't just publish, here's the one-pager on how human rights touches this case. We have to make sure that they can use it responsibly. Yeah.
I think you're right. If we do these addendums, which I think is a neat idea, but it comes with a whole range of additional activities to then ensure that people understand where we're coming from, how we want to see them being used. And I don't want that the original authors of the case studies feel criticized in any way. It's just an additional perspective that we would like to offer. Or instructors feeling criticized in any way. It's an additional offer. So yes, some faculty training for how to truly use those briefings then will be an additional activity that we're hoping to engage in. All right. My closing thoughts?
Sure. So just a few thoughts of where we've been the last hour and a half. This is clearly a challenging time. Nina, your comments reflect that. We're in a complicated world, polarized world. Governments aren't behaving the way they ought to. There's a governance gap. Most people in the world now live in a place where their own government is not willing or able to protect their own people. And that means that big businesses wind up in the middle of these big complicated issues where they're not very comfortable, but they're there. And at the end of the day, as educators, our job is to enlighten them, to help them, to challenge them, to support them as they're trying to figure out how to navigate this world. It's also a time, and Dora just sort of alluded to this, where there's enormous pressure, especially I would say coming from European businesses and European governments, but also North America, that somehow there's a tension between business competitiveness and human rights. And that's part of, there's a recently UNDP study which says, no, there's really no problem. You can do human rights and be competitive, and there's no cost. That's an irresponsible way to look at it. There is a cost. It's a cost of people, money, time, energy. If you want to do it right, you have to spend time and energy. So part of our role is not to fall to prey to that trap that says somehow it's all free, but to say, actually, this is what good companies do in the long term. Dora's comment, there's a business case to be made. You'll hire the best people, you'll retain them, you'll have better community relations, you'll avoid some of the risks. So we can make the case, we can't make it in 3 months. And so that's the first thing. We're in a complicated point. We've got some governments that are basically saying, the hell with this stuff. It doesn't add to the bottom line. We want to help business just on a free-for-all. We need to be strong and say, no, that's not the responsible thing to do. It's not the right thing to do. Second thing to say is this is about essentially looking at business models. It's not about charity. It's not about pretending that this is somebody else's problem. A lot of business and human rights is about outsourcing responsibility. Companies say, you know, there's a big problem out there, but it's not my problem. No, it's everybody's problem. And if your name is on the product, if you're benefiting from what's being mined, you know, manufactured, farmed, fished, whatever, you bear some responsibility. So we need to be looking smartly at business models and what are the challenges. And again, it's not a question of pushing companies and telling them they're terrible. And this goes back to what Dan raised at the beginning. It's saying we want businesses to succeed, but we want them to succeed and be responsible in the way they operate. So we need to push and we need to help. That's what this is about. Future business leaders need to be equipped to do the best they can. Last comment from me. This meeting, a lot of what's been most interesting is in a category I would call innovation. We've talked about case studies. We've talked about clinics. We've talked about addendum to existing case studies which are not capturing the human rights dimension of whatever's in there. We've talked about experiential learning. We've talked about transitional research, you know, moving away just from traditional academic notions of if it's not a peer-reviewed journal, it's not important. We need to sort of take a fresh look at business education. We've talked about an integrated approach. Environment and human rights are not in separate buckets. They're together. We've talked about integrating with other courses. Human rights can't be a silo, but nor can finance, nor can management or operations or accounting. So there's, I think, a lot of energy around the notion that business education, as good as it is, could be a heck of a lot better. And there's some things, one of the advantages about being in a new field is that we're not constrained the way management or finance are. They've been doing things for a long time, and it's hard to move the ship. We've got a little tiny boat, but we've just started. And so this is a chance to actually challenge some of the orthodoxies of the way business education has been conceived and actually do some innovative things that might nudge some of our brethren to do the same thing. So this is, to me, a very exciting moment, as much as it's a challenging moment. And it's for us to figure out how to move forward and make the most of the opportunity of being in the small boat. So thank you all for being here. And thank you, Dora. It's really, you've done a great job.